Welcome everyone to another edition of Midweek with Max. This is Rick, joined by JCV, Joshua, and of course our co-founder Max Sanchez. I'm going to kick it immediately over to Max for the weekly updates, and then we will get into some of your questions and some other updates. Take it away, sir.
All right, awesome. So a couple of exciting things this week. We got the HBit VM white paper draft. So we sent that to Discord as an early preview, and we'll be posting that later this week with obviously any changes we notice between now and then if there's a notation issue or whatever, but also some more digestible content. So we'll have a blog post and a X thread about it. And so the blog post will be more of a somewhat technical deep dive, but a little more geared towards understanding the high level of it versus the white paper is obviously much lower level looking at the mechanics. So that's been posted to general. So it's kind of a Discord exclusive for the next few days, and then we'll get that pushed out more broadly publicly in a non-draft format. So obviously people haven't had a lot of time to look at it. I posted it like an hour and a half ago. So if there's any questions people have so far, happy to go over those today. But we'll also be doing a special breakout engineering AMA just to focus on HBit and VM. And we're tentatively going to schedule that for Friday at the same time as Midweek is normally on Tuesdays. So that's 11 a.m. Eastern. So we'll announce a formal announcement once will announce an announcement. Rick, it's not just you today. We will post a formal announcement once we actually get that scheduled. But look forward to that probably at the end of the week on Friday. And then beyond that, been doing a lot of work post V2 update. So Fusaka took out a lot of third-party RPC infrastructure, so we had some things to fight and solve just on the infrastructure side, keeping everything running there. But everything's now stabilized from the third-party RPC perspective, so that's looking good. And we've gotten through the V2 update. So we will be pushing out. There's one issue with SnapSync that we're fixing, so we're getting that in, and then we'll push out a formal V2 release for anyone who wants to upgrade to V2. For now, that's an optional upgrade, but it will become a required upgrade when we schedule the Jovian activation, either later this month or early January. So we'll let everyone know ahead of time so people have time to update nodes and upgrade their databases and everything they need to do. But just know that that's on the horizon in the next few weeks to a month here for getting Jovian shipped. And beyond that, just a lot more work on general, working on some ZK provability stuff, working on some stuff for MinerFi, getting that coordination daemon figured out for the key resharing and threshold key generation. So working through a bunch of things there. And I think those are probably all the major updates. One thing less directly protocol engineering related, but we are going to be launching something called HBUSD. It's a one-way Hemi burn to USD stablecoin protocol, and it's basically a interesting experiment. There may be some cool applications of it, and that's something that Jeff built. So we're going to be launching that by the end of the month, and we're also going to be doing some community stuff around that with a art project. I don't know, Rick, if you want to mention anything about that. If not, we will have a announcement out probably in the next few days for that competition.
Yeah, I can chime in on that. So basically, there's going to be two winners for this competition. The theme is going to be Hemi plus permanence. So if anyone wants to get a head start on that theme, it's going to be, as Max said, an HBUSD contest where people will be designing an NFT. There's going to be a first place winner, which will be the 100 HBUSD NFT, and another for the 10 HBUSD NFT. So we're going to be having two winners. You will be winning some merch, some Hemi tokens, and I believe you'll get a free mint of your own NFT should you win. So that's going to be super exciting. And speaking of merch, don't forget the Hemi Community Collection is readily available now. There's my plug for the week. And yes, Miracle, an NFT design contest. You're welcome. All right, back to Max.
Cool. So looking forward to that. That's going to be fun going into the holidays. And then aside from that, getting the new pop payout algo V2 ready to ship on testnet. Now that we're through all the V2 general madness, we can get the payout algorithm shipped on testnet and start running that. And then if everything looks good there, then in a few weeks activate that on mainnet. So that will be coming out by the end of this week. And I think that's all of the major things. So for anyone here who is interested in the HBit VM white paper, I see we got some people joining late, so I'll just repeat this. We are going to be doing a breakout engineering AMA just to focus on that on Friday. And so the white papers in general, if people want to read through it, you have a couple days to digest it, and then we'll answer questions. Obviously, if anyone has any today, happy to answer them, but we'll do a full dedicated session on Friday just talking about that. And as a little bit of a guide, if you do want to read through the white paper, sections 4 and 5 are pretty much the meat of everything. The other sections are summaries of existing technologies, some of the issues with the canonical BitVM2 design that we're addressing, and then some additional, helping understand how all the system components fit together. So sections 6 through 9 cover stuff like how veHEMI fits into the equation, what the updated BitVM transaction graph looks like now that we have HBitVM, and some other things with a way to use an MEV marketplace to make some things a little more capital efficient. But sections 4 and 5 are really the meat of the novel technology. And we also separated into two different pieces. So there's the HBitVM proof system and the HBitVM tunnel, which is a use case of the proof system. So kind of like not a direct comparison, but in some ways, kind of like the BitVM2 paper has BitVM2, which is the in a vacuum protocol, and then BitVM2 bridge, which is an application of the BitVM technology in a certain way. We're doing something similar with the HBitVM proof system, which is how we use Bitcoin and Ethereum with proof of proof and HVM to create basically non-influenceable or non-forgeable proofs of Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Hemi state in a way that's secured both by Bitcoin proof of work and Ethereum proof of stake. And so that's a generic protocol that you could use or adapt to a lot of different use cases. So our first use case is, of course, going to be for the HBitVM tunnel, but you can also do cool stuff like remix it into a native Bitcoin clearance protocol for options and futures and other financial derivatives. You could turn it into a Bitcoin-backed stablecoin protocol, native Bitcoin-backed lending protocol. So there's a lot of cool things going forward that you can use that core technology for. And then, so that's section 4, and then section 5 is focusing specifically on a little bit of details of how that proof system works, but then also how it fits into a actual tunnel design, and then some of the tunnel design improvements we can make based on that HBitVM proof system. So kind of an overview of how the paper is separated. And again, if you want to get to the meat of it, sections 4 and 5 are really the most important parts, and then the rest are kind of surrounding stuff that flesh out various aspects of the protocol. So glad to have that out there. Again, we'll be publishing that publicly with some other content like a blog post and an X thread sometime later this week. And with that, I will turn it over to Rick and we can start going through questions.
All right, thank you, Max. Following questions, we now that I'm looking at some of the questions, we'll probably have some updates as we go. So let's start things off with a common question. When will VBK updates be shared? And will it be before the end of the year?
Coming soon, and yes, definitely before the end of the year.
All right, VBK before 2026. Any updates on the Hemi Alliance? Yes, I do have an update regarding that. So the Hemi Alliance, as you know, kind of came to an abrupt end, but starting in early 2026, I can't say an exact date because I don't have one, but what I can say is myself, Jeremy, John Greenwood, Ryan, and Joshua have been working on a formal ambassador program for the Hemi community, and you can expect to see that in very early 2026. I would say no later than February. We are working with a very exciting external partner, and the way things are shaping out, it sounds like we may be the first person on this platform, or the first company rather. Hemi's not a person. Be kind of weird if it was, but we will be the first entity on this platform, and we have some cool rewards. We have some cool tasking set up for it, and yes, as Josh said, someone please make Hemi as a person, as a meme. Thank you, Josh. I really can't talk today, can I? But anyway, expect an ambassador program coming in early 2026. It's going to really re-energize and redefine what Hemi creatives um, are and can do, and I really think you guys are going to enjoy it. So let us move on to our next question, which is when veHEMI staking rewards.
We should be doing the next reward cycle definitely before the end of the year. Obviously, given the holidays, it probably won't be during that, so probably in the next week or so.
All right. Um, okay, here's one that was discussed yesterday in one of our calls. I'm going to turn this over to the broader team on the call to give some explanations, etc. But when will the OG role be claimable?
For now, we're going to say February. There's not a lot of work left to be done on it, but there's a lot of other things that are taking engineering precedence. So we're going to set a date for February just to be safe, because we've been obviously having delays and we don't want to keep moving the date out. So right now we're targeting February, but I'll turn it over to Joshua if he wants to add any additional comments to it.
The core Discord wallet linking stuff is done. There's quite a bit of engineering work required on the UI and Discord linking part. So unfortunately, we don't currently have the resources to finish it, but we are targeting February.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. So everyone, we apologize. You're just going to have to be patient. We don't want to keep moving the goalposts, so February should be the drop dead target for this, and it is coming. The rewards are not canceled. Nothing is canceled. It's just taking a little longer than expected. That meme is hilarious. Thank you, Lyco. All right, moving on to some engineering questions. What is the difference between a tunnel and a bridge? And are there security concerns or differences between the two?
Good question. So tunnel is basically just our term for bridge, but it does represent a smaller subset of all the things that could constitute a bridge. So a tunnel is two ways, not a one-way bridge, and a tunnel is specifically a more secure way of moving assets between networks than some of the other technologies that have been called tunnels in the past, or that have been called bridges in the past, rather.
All right. Let's see. Why is it so expensive to swap from Ethereum to Hemi, even with Hemi's native tunnel?
Not sure what this is in reference to. If you're asking, there's a couple different things this could mean. So if you're talking about moving assets between Ethereum and Hemi, you're always going to have to pay Ethereum fees either to initiate the deposit transaction or to prove and claim the withdrawal transaction. So you're always going to be incurring Ethereum transaction fees when you're moving from Ethereum to Hemi or from Hemi back to Ethereum. The other thing this could be asking is about the DEX liquidity if you're swapping between, if you're talking about swapping between Hemi tokens and Ethereum. So part of that could be DEX liquidity, depending on which pairs you're trading, which input asset you're using. So not sure what that question is asking, but hopefully that answers it. But the transaction fees themselves at a protocol level on Hemi are extremely cheap.
All right. Um, Oddly, the final question I have in this list. Wow. Okay. Well, I got some more updates, so this is fine. Uh, when will the new pop payout algorithm be implemented?
Now that we're finally through all the V2 and Fusaka stuff, we should be launching that in testnet this week.
It's a Christmas
And
miracle.
the
Everything's coming soon. This is great,
and the
but not like actually soon.
and the contracts have been deployed, so we just need to deploy the updated daemon that actually performs the payouts on the sequencer. But the contract for that is already live and funded on testnet.
Oh dear God. All right, here we go. We got some more questions coming in. All right, Max, this is going to be good practice for whatever the hell we're going to eventually call Teach Rick Crypto. Can you explain like I'm five? HBit VM and how its tunneling system works.
I would love to. All right, so a little bit of background. So Bitcoin basically has a lot of limitations that other chains like Ethereum don't have. So a lot of people are familiar with Ethereum. You have an EVM, you can write smart contracts. You can do what's called Turing-complete smart contracts, which means basically anything that is computable, you could run on Ethereum. Obviously, there's a gas limit to how many instructions your program can take and how much stuff it can do. But basically, anything that you can think of and write as a program, you could run on Ethereum theoretically. And Bitcoin, on the other hand, is extremely limited. And so it doesn't have it does technically have a smart contract language. It's called Bitcoin script, but it's very limited in what it can do. So you don't have in programming what's called like flow control. So you can't, you have a little bit of it with, if else, and you can do some conditionals, but you can't do things like loops. You can't do generic jumps in the compiled program. And so what you can write that happens on Bitcoin is limited to basically just what the opcodes let you do. And so you can do stuff like verifying a signature. You can do stuff like, adding numbers together. You can do some bitwise functions. You can, add and subtract, but beyond that, there's really not a lot that Bitcoin script lets you do. And it's a very limiting language to work in. And the other thing with Bitcoin is which is both a blessing and a curse, depending on what you're building. It's something called the UTXO model, which is basically each Bitcoin transaction. This is a little informal, but each Bitcoin transaction basically lives in a vacuum. And so it can't really see what else is happening on Bitcoin. So when you look at Ethereum, you have something like, you can have, somebody deployed Uniswap contracts. And whenever someone interacts with them, they can update some state. And then the next person that interacts with the contract, that state's now updated. And you could launch another contract that reads stuff from the Uniswap contract and does something with it. Like, this is not a suggestion, this is generally a bad idea, but like use it as a price oracle for a protocol or something to see, okay, there's a DEX over there, people are trading on it. What's the current price of ETH to USDC on this Uniswap pool? And you create a contract that looks at that. On Bitcoin, so on Ethereum, that's what's called the accounts model. And so you have accounts. Accounts can either be EOAs or they can be smart contracts. They can interact with each other. Smart contracts can store state. As people interact with them, that state can change. Other contracts can read state from other contracts. And so you have this very composable environment to write complex programs, complex DeFi protocols, or whatever it is, in the Ethereum account model with the EVM. On Bitcoin with the UTXOs, each account or each UTXO, each unspent transaction output operates in a vacuum. So again, you do have that Bitcoin script language. And so you do have a little more capability than some people understand on Bitcoin. It's not just sending Bitcoin to and from addresses. You can write a script that only allows you to spend funds after waiting a year, or only allows you to spend funds if you have a signature and also a pre-image to a hash, which sort of acts like a password. And there's issues with that because people can see the password when it's propagated on the network. And so you also protect it with the signature, but you can do some more complex stuff. But again, you can't build, Uniswap directly on Bitcoin, right? And so what HBitVM does a couple different things. So there's, like I mentioned earlier, there's the HBitVM proof system, and then there's the HBitVM tunnel system that uses the proof system to create a tunnel design or a bridge design. And so Bitcoin can't see itself. That's another limitation. So Bitcoin lacks what's called self-introspection. So on Ethereum, you can look at stuff like not only the state of other contracts, but the state of the chain itself. You can see what the current block timestamp is. You can see what the current block hash is. You can do stuff on Ethereum that's aware of what the general Ethereum chain that it's executing on looks like. On Bitcoin, you don't have that. Bitcoin, when you execute a Bitcoin script by spending an output and creating a transaction, that runs in isolation. It doesn't know what Bitcoin block it's in. It doesn't know what the canonical Bitcoin tip currently is. It doesn't know if another transaction's happened or not. And so the original breakthrough of BitVM, or really BitVM and BitVM2, which HBitVM's based on, as you can probably tell by the name, BitVM2, the main innovation, couple main innovations, but one of them was using something called connector outputs, which was not a new idea. It had been around in the ecosystem a bit, but it's basically a way to construct Bitcoin transactions in a certain way that one transaction can burn a connector output by spending it and prevent another transaction from being able to execute. So you can have some sort of flow control through a graph of Bitcoin transactions. The second part was covenant emulation, which when you combine that with connector outputs, basically lets you emulate covenants. And so the idea of covenants is basically being able to send Bitcoin in such a way that you can encumber its future transfer. And so a very simple example of a covenant would be I send Bitcoin to JCV, but I say he can only withdraw it and send it to Joshua unless he waits a year. And so that doesn't sound very interesting, but there's a lot of use cases in that for stuff like estate planning
Can I just slide in real quick? And one way to think about covenants, because if you don't have an idea of what a covenant is, a lot of this doesn't make sense. A covenant is kind of like, I'm giving you Bitcoin, but with a rule attached to it.
That is a much better way to put it. Thank you. Yeah, covenants, it's a... Go ahead, Rick.
I'm sorry. I was also going to add that when we cover this on the still to be named Teach Rick Crypto, JCV, I'm going to need a lot of pop culture references because until you said that, I was like, what the hell is this?
JCV is a lot better at the distilled explanations and the analogies. Yeah, covenants are basically, like JCV said, sending Bitcoin with additional rules attached to it. And so again, send it to somebody, but they can only send it to somebody else, or they can only send it to, they can only take half of it out and send the other half to somebody else unless they wait, 2 years and then they can access all of it or whatever. And so Bitcoin today can't do covenants natively. And people argue whether that's a good or bad thing. Some people in the Bitcoin core community are concerned that Bitcoin covenants will be the end of Bitcoin as a sovereign digital currency. I think those concerns are way overblown, but there are some legitimate concerns with certain types of covenants and some stuff that they could enable for, enforcing like KYC AML policies on a certain pool of the circulating Bitcoin, things like that. But covenants, for our purpose, the reason you'd want a covenant is so you could have some way to control the spending of, or the withdrawing, in the case of a tunnel design, the Bitcoin from a UTXO predicated on certain conditions being met. And so if we forget about Bitcoin for a second and look back at the Ethereum landscape, for example, you could have a zero knowledge bridge design that settles back to Ethereum, and that is essentially a version of a covenant. You have assets that are held by a smart contract, and they're only released when certain conditions are met. When somebody comes with a ZK proof that they, burned 1,000 USDC on the L2, then with that receipt, they're able to go to the smart contract on Ethereum and say, here's my ZK proof, give me my 1,000 USDC out of the underlying L1 contract. So that's essentially what we're trying to replicate on Bitcoin, is be able to put Bitcoin somewhere where nobody can touch it unless they fulfill certain conditions. In this case, do something on the L2 that entitles them to the Bitcoin back on the L1 system. And again, Bitcoin script's limited, so on Ethereum, it's super easy to build something like that. And not only is it super easy, we've had that, the ecosystem has had that running for 3, 4, 5 years now. But on the Bitcoin side, you can't just use covenants to encumber Bitcoin natively, and you also can't validate zero knowledge proofs natively. So on Ethereum, you can write a ZK proof verifier that takes somewhere between 400 and 800,000 gas. So relatively cheap to execute in the scheme of things. You can fit many of them inside of an Ethereum block, and you can use that to basically take whatever the L2 is doing and, in air quotes, compress it into a ZK proof that demonstrates you're entitled to some assets, and you can pull them out on the L1. And on the Bitcoin side, we can't do covenants and we can't do ZK proof verification. And so without either of those, there's really not a good way to build a bridge or a tunnel system. So what BitVM2 did, again, like I said, they did connector outputs plus covenant emulation. And so you can emulate covenants by having a committee of people pre-sign a transaction and then destroy their keys. And that basically means that only the transactions they sign before they destroy their keys are ever possible. So I can't send JCV Bitcoin and say it can only go to Joshua, but if Joshua, Rick, and I created a 3 of 3 threshold signature where we signed the transaction to, I sent the funds to JCV and then we signed the transaction, well, didn't send them to JCV, but we sent them to an address that JCV, or a Bitcoin script that JCV has partial control over. And then we sign another transaction that spends those funds that are quote unquote sent to JCV. But the only way that they can be spent is either instantly to send half of it to Joshua, half of it back to JCV, or after a year, send all of it to JCV. If we signed that transaction and we deleted, at least one of us deleted our keys, nobody could sign an alternate conflicting transaction that lets JCV or anyone else do something else with that Bitcoin other than those two rules we enforced by signing those transactions. And so with that kind of a system, you can emulate covenants. So you can you can have a group of people collaboratively sign only the spend transactions for a particular output that the protocol wants to be able to happen, or the person wants to be able to happen. And so this is, in a spiritual sense, kind of similar to KZG setup ceremonies. Obviously very different on the cryptographic side, and also different on the number of people you can have realistically participate. But essentially, as long as one of the participants is honest and burns their key, then nobody else can create a conflicting spend transaction that violates the rules of the covenant. And so in practice, you can have, a group of 100 or potentially 1,000 people all participate in a threshold signature scheme, which basically you can think of it like a more efficient multi-sig that under the hood uses some cryptographic techniques. So it's not 1,000 signatures, it's one combined signature that 1,000 people contributed to creating. So it's very small, and very efficient to verify. But you have that security of, as long as that group of 1,000 people do not all collude to sign alternate transactions, nobody can do anything to break the covenant you're trying to enforce on the Bitcoin. And so great, that lets us do covenants, but then what do we do with them? And the second part that I mentioned earlier was the inability to verify ZK proofs on Bitcoin. And that was the other breakthrough of veHEMI2, which was a relatively efficient way to be able to validate a ZK proof. So Bitcoin script's super limited, but you can theoretically unroll any circuit, anything that you can compute into Bitcoin script. It's extremely inefficient. Even opcodes like opcat that people have been arguing over for years would make this way easier to do. But basically, you can theoretically write a ZK verifier in Bitcoin script, but it's super huge, on the order of 1, 2, 3 gigabytes. And so you can't actually use that on Bitcoin because it's way too big. But what you can do with, and again, this is all veHEMI2 background stuff, and then we'll get into HBitVM. But what veHEMI2 did is basically said, okay, we can't run this giant script on Bitcoin, but we can separate it into a ton of tiny little pieces. And we can have an optimistic challenger verification model where we can basically say, we took this, call it a 2 gigabyte program. We broke it out into 2,000 bits, 2,000 pieces that are each, say, 4 megabytes in size, because that's the Bitcoin block size limit. And what we can do is we can have somebody commit to a ZK proof, the person who's trying to actually, quote unquote, validate the ZK proof on Bitcoin. They can commit to the ZK proof using something called Lamport signatures, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But they can basically commit to what they believe is a valid ZK proof, or what they're claiming is a valid ZK proof. And then everyone else can run the actual 2 gigabyte Bitcoin script program, and they can see which of those chunks it failed in. So they can see, maybe the ZK proof fails on the 100th chunk of that 2,000 chunk program. Then whoever detects which chunk that the ZK verification breaks on, which chunk of that Bitcoin script that's part of that giant ZK verifier program, they can basically take that chunk and just run that chunk on Bitcoin to prove that the ZK proof is invalid. So it's not ZK verification, but it's optimistic ZK verification. So when you talk about ZK bridges on Ethereum, you have the actual ZK proof is getting verified in a way that nobody could ever lie about it, because it's actually verified on Ethereum. On Bitcoin, you can get close to that, where you can say, here's the ZK proof, but you do need somebody, and that could be a permissionless, anyone in the world could see that the ZK proof is invalid, and they could, again, run through the program, see which chunk it fails on, and then bring just that chunk of that giant Bitcoin ZK verifier program on chain, run that 4 megabyte script on Bitcoin, and then prove that the ZK proof therefore must be invalid, and the person who's trying to withdraw the funds is not able to withdraw the Bitcoin. So that's sort of laying the groundwork of BitVM2 and sort of the whole BitVM design space. Different people are working on different things. Projects like BitVMX, for example, are focusing more on the BitVM1 style design, but with a lot of optimizations, which is not focused on a specific, ZK verifier circuit on Bitcoin, but instead is looking at much more broad, being able to run I believe they're doing a RISC-V style CPU and validate things about a program run on a RISC-V CPU on Bitcoin. So there's those offshoots, and then there's also offshoots of BitVM2, which are trying to optimize the protocol in different ways to do different things, whether that be trying to be more capital efficient by changing the transaction graph, or trying to, with what we saw with BitVM3S, optimize that Bitcoin script using a cryptographic technique called garbled circuits, which is beyond the scope of today, but maybe we'll get into on Friday. But it's basically a way to make the program that has to run on Bitcoin a lot smaller by doing a lot more things off-chain. And so there's BitVM2, which is this kind of core breakthrough on how to build a ZK-esque bridge on Bitcoin by being able to verify a ZK proof and effectively enforce covenants with covenant emulation and connector outputs, and also be able to move state, and I'll say that in air quotes, but move state between Bitcoin transactions. Like I said earlier, every Bitcoin transaction, when you spend the input and you trigger a Bitcoin script program running, the Bitcoin script runs in a vacuum, and so it doesn't have access to what else is happening on Bitcoin, or you can't have like one Bitcoin transaction that sets a variable and then another Bitcoin transaction can read from it. And so the other final piece of BitVM2 was being able to transfer state in some cases between transactions by using, like I said, I'll come back to Lamport signatures, which is a one-time signature scheme. So a lot of people are probably familiar with things like ECDSA, or basically when you do a Bitcoin or Ethereum transaction, normally you are signing that transaction with your private key, and you can do that a bunch of times. You can sign a bunch of different transactions, and as long as the cryptography is implemented correctly, like with ECDSA, there's some stuff with a securely generated random nonce that you use as part of the signing process. But in general, most digital signature schemes let you do many signatures with one private key. Lamport signatures only let you do one. So once you sign one message, if you sign another message with that same key, then you're revealing part of your private key. And to take a step back, the reason that's actually a good thing, which it normally wouldn't be, but the reason it's a good thing in the context of BitVM style constructions or moving state between Bitcoin transactions is if somebody signs some data that they commit to in one transaction with their Lamport signature, if they sign different data in another transaction, then they've leaked enough of their private key that somebody can grab the leaked bits of their private key and prove to another Bitcoin transaction that the user signed conflicting data, and therefore we can spend their connector output and remove them as a protocol participant because they're moving state. So basically, Lamport signatures, what's normally, and this is sort of a common theme with BitVM style constructions, what sounds like a bug is actually a feature. And so same thing for Lamport signatures. They're one time, which normally is not a good thing for a digital signature algorithm. But in this case, it actually is a good thing because we can prove that somebody signed two conflicting pieces of information, because in doing so, they leak enough of their private key that basically a Bitcoin script would be able to verify that they misbehaved. And so you can, depending on what protocol you're building, you can use that to earn their connector output that removes them from being able to continue on to the next part of the protocol or whatever. And so those are sort of the foundation. So you have the ability to optimistically verify a ZK proof on Bitcoin, and you have the ability to enforce covenants on Bitcoin that keeps it locked away unless certain things happen. And you have the ability to move state between Bitcoin transactions so that if somebody commits to something in one transaction, either they can't lie about it and input something else into a different transaction, or it allows them to sign something in a way that somebody else can use that data in another transaction in a way that only that original user approved of. And so with all that, those are sort of the building blocks that we have from BitVM2. The issue with BitVM2, at least the canonical design, and there's a lot of offshoots that have tried different ways to solve this. But the primary issue is with something called superblock like client emulation. So I mentioned earlier that Bitcoin can't see itself, which means when you run a Bitcoin script, it can't look and see that another Bitcoin transaction happened, or that some proof that it's validating is actually a proof of the current canonical Bitcoin chain. And so Bitcoin can't see itself, unlike Ethereum, which can. You can write a smart contract, again, like I said, that looks at, a recent block hash or the current block number or block time, things like that. And so that's the one missing piece that was an issue with the original BitVM2 design. And the way that they solved it was with something called superblock like client emulation. I won't go too deep into the details, but we have an appendix in the white paper that goes deep and does an economic analysis of it. But essentially, since Bitcoin can't see itself, they introduced this mechanism to collaboratively sort of agree on what the canonical Bitcoin block is. And then when it validates the ZK proof and the rest of the stuff that we were talking about, that ZK proof uses that agreed upon canonical Bitcoin block as something to validate against. And so, for example, with a BitVM style tunnel design, what you need that ZK proof to validate both that a user initiated a withdrawal on the L2, and we can get into this. I'll explain this part of the system a little bit later, but one of the operators of the system fronted liquidity and basically sent the user the Bitcoin that they withdrew on the canonical Bitcoin chain, and then is trying to get reimbursed from the protocol. And so you have to validate L2 state. So you do that with the ZK proof, but you also need to validate that something that's happened on Bitcoin before this vault is allowed to be opened up and allowing a specific operator to take the Bitcoin back out of the underlying vault. And since Bitcoin can't see itself, you have this issue of, okay, you have a ZK proof, but ZK proofs kind of also live in a vacuum. So for example, I can prove that I know the prime integer factorization of a certain number, but I can't prove that I don't know the prime integer factorization of a second number, because you're proving in an unbound space. And so blockchain operates sort of in a vacuum like that, where, and this gets into consensus protocols, but when you look at something like Bitcoin, you cannot ZK prove that something is the canonical Bitcoin chain. So you can prove that there is a Bitcoin chain with a certain amount of proof of work on it. You can't prove that somebody else doesn't have another Bitcoin chain with more proof of work on it. And the way that that's solved in practice in blockchain today is everybody on the peer-to-peer network talks to each other. And one peer says, hey, I have a longer Bitcoin chain, and they send it to the person who has only knowledge of the shorter Bitcoin chain. And then that remote peer says, oh, okay, this is a heavier chain and has more proof of work. I'll switch over to this and decide that this is the canonical chain. And so that's how it works in Bitcoin's proof of work. On Ethereum, it's a little more complicated, which I'll get into in a second, but essentially the same idea of everybody on the peer-to-peer network sends around their knowledge of the chain, and then as long as things are going well, in Ethereum's case, there's some times where this is not the case, which is part of what HBitVM is set out to solve. But generally speaking, if all peers on a network can talk to each other, they can all agree on what the current canonical chain is by which one has the most consensus weight or proof of work or whatever. And so, again, going back to ZK proofs, you can't ZK prove that a certain chain is the heaviest, because there is an unbounded amount of potential alternate Bitcoin chains that could exist, and so one person is generating the ZK proof, and so they're generating it based on their view of Bitcoin or what they want to claim their view of Bitcoin is, which could be an alternate Bitcoin chain. And so that could be potentially used by operators to pretend that they fronted the liquidity in the system when they actually didn't. So to basically do the liquidity fronting correctly on Bitcoin, but do it on a forked chain of Bitcoin. And then they could construct a ZK proof of that non-canonical Bitcoin chain. And there's no way since Bitcoin can't see itself, there's no way for Bitcoin to know that that ZK proof is actually of another non-canonical Bitcoin chain, and therefore the operator misbehaved and should be taken out of the system. And so we can now validate ZK proofs on Bitcoin, but we have an issue of how do we know what we're validating is actually the correct thing to validate. And so the way that HBitVM, or the way that BitVM2 solved this, is something called superblock light client emulation. Like I said, won't dive into the details, but basically it does solve the issue by preventing malicious operators from being able to fake a ZK proof of what is the canonical Bitcoin chain. But it opens up a new vulnerability where Bitcoin miners could withhold a portion of their chain and basically ransom attack the operators. So to give you an example, and this isn't exactly how it works, but basically I'm a Bitcoin miner and I mine a heavier Bitcoin chain than exists. That's how Bitcoin mining always works. I could choose to withhold the block that I just mined. And if nobody else mines a block, then I could give a ZK proof of a Bitcoin chain that nobody else knows about. And the way that superblock light client emulation works, it doesn't use ZK proofs for this, but it uses a collaborative process where the operator says, here's the best Bitcoin block that I know of. Actually, what they do is they commit to what's called a super block, which is a statistically abnormally heavy Bitcoin block. So when you mine Bitcoin, you have a certain target. And so say, the target's 1,000. You can think of each attempt at Bitcoin mining, each SHA-256 hash you do as a lottery ticket. And that has a random number on it. And if your number is below 1,000, then you get to mine a block. And so on average, half of the blocks will be below the number 500, 25% of them will be below the number 250, et cetera. And so it would be very hard to set out intentionally to generate a block that has, a hash of 2. But statistically speaking, over a long period of blocks, somebody will mine a block that has the difficulty of 2. And so the idea of super blocks is you can use that as sort of a proxy for the heaviest Bitcoin chain. And you can use that to agree on a plausible canonical version of Bitcoin. But the issue is if somebody happens to mine a block with a hash of 2, they can say, instead of submitting this to the main network, I'm going to withhold this block and I'm going to use it to trick the system into thinking the operator is not behaving correctly and basically ransom attack them. So an operator is trying to pull 100 Bitcoin out of a vault, and you could go to that operator and say, hey, you committed to this super block, which is the correct super block on the canonical Bitcoin chain, but I withheld this other super block that nobody knows about. But if I publish it to the system, I will be able to trick it into thinking that you're misbehaving and you'll lose that 100 Bitcoin. So why don't you send me 10 Bitcoin and I won't publish this super block. And so this ransom attack basically makes it so the solution to the problem of malicious operators becomes now a problem of malicious Bitcoin miners being able to do these ransom attacks. And so there's been a lot of different BitVM2 based technologies that try to solve this in certain ways, but a lot of those end up introducing more centralization than the original BitVM2 protocol set out to do. And depending on which approach you're looking at, there's other limitations too, and some things take longer or require more participants to be coordinating in order for the protocol to operate properly, things like that. So with HBitVM, the summary is basically we're preserving all of the original trust assumptions of the original BitVM2 design, but we're solving the superblock light client emulation by basically making that ZK proof a self-contained proof of the canonical Bitcoin chain. And we're also, by doing that, we're also simplifying the transaction graph. So it doesn't make the overall protocol simpler, but it makes the part that happens on Bitcoin simpler, which also makes it faster. And so basically BitVM2, all these great primitives, but you have the superblock light client emulation problem. And with HBitVM, we are solving that in a creative way using proof of proof and HVM and Ethereum to basically hold up a mirror to Bitcoin and reflect Bitcoin's current state back to itself, so that we can now have a ZK proof that doesn't need any sort of agreement on what the canonical Bitcoin chain is, because it's actually baked into the ZK proof. And the way that we do that, and this is the sort of core innovation of the HBitVM proof system, and again, that's the sort of in a vacuum component that you could use as a primitive to build a bunch of other types of protocols other than just a tunnel design. But the HBitVM proof system, what we do is we basically create a system where Bitcoin proof of work secures Ethereum proof of stake, and Ethereum proof of stake secures Bitcoin proof of work. And we can do that with basically a modification to proof of proof. And so what we can do is we can publish Ethereum data to Bitcoin. So not data of the Hemi network, we're doing that too, but publish data of the Ethereum network itself to Bitcoin at a regular cadence. And then we can use Hemi's view of Bitcoin through HVM as a way to observe and basically protect against somebody forging a fake Ethereum chain. And so we're using let me back up a moment. Let me explain that a little more clearly. So we're using Ethereum as an anti-censorship layer to establish canonical Bitcoin state. So basically, anyone can take, once we add some more features to HVM in the next version, anyone can take consensus knowledge of Bitcoin, which is basically Bitcoin headers, and they can send them to Ethereum, and then Hemi sucks it up into the L2 protocol. HVM indexes those Bitcoin transactions, and then HVM and through Hemi has a view of the canonical Bitcoin state that nobody can manipulate or forge or, in air quotes, eclipse attack or anything like that. Because anyone, as long as Ethereum is not being actively censored by the majority of currently active Ethereum consensus power, anyone would be able to relay anything about Bitcoin's consensus state to Hemi and have HVM update to that view of Bitcoin. So we now have this Ethereum-powered external observer of Bitcoin. So we sort of solved the Bitcoin can't see itself problem because we're using Ethereum as this layer for anyone, kind of like when I was talking about earlier, where on a peer-to-peer network, if everyone can talk, they can all agree what the canonical Bitcoin chain is. This is the same thing, but done on Ethereum. So now anyone who has access to submit an Ethereum transaction is able to essentially replicate the Bitcoin peer-to-peer protocol in some very, very vague sense, and basically allow Hemi through this data on Ethereum to come to agreement on what the canonical Bitcoin state is that anyone can contribute to. And so we're able to, so now we've established we have a censorship resistant view of Bitcoin on Ethereum, and we have HVM, which indexes that view of Bitcoin so we can pull tons of detailed information out about it. The problem is that's all living on Ethereum, and Ethereum uses proof of stake. And proof of stake doesn't have the same security properties as proof of work does on Bitcoin. And so the next step is basically, okay, now we've established a secure censorship resistant canonical view of Bitcoin by using Ethereum as an anti-censorship layer. But now we need to flip it around and use Bitcoin to secure Ethereum against what's called nothing at stake attacks. And so you can think of this as, on Bitcoin, if you were to try to attack Bitcoin and create an alternate chain, do a double spend, anything like that, you would need to spend as much computational power, slightly more computational power than the current chain spent being built by all of the existing Bitcoin miners. That's what's called a 51% attack. And so on Bitcoin, if you want to create an alternate history of Bitcoin, you need to have essentially 51% of the Bitcoin proof of work mining power. 51% of all the ASICs operational in existence, you need to have control over. And on Ethereum, that is the case for very short-term reorg. So if you were going to try to create a alternate chain that forks back, 100 blocks or something, you would need 51% of the current Ethereum consensus power, which generally speaking, you can assume nobody can get access to, right? There's, tons of different people who are running Ethereum nodes and doing proof of stake mining and have different amounts of Ethereum staked. There's no, single participant realistically who can get access to 51% of the current Ethereum power. And so that keeps Ethereum secure, generally speaking, against nothing at stake attacks. And if somebody were to try to attack Ethereum and they created a legitimate chain and then created an alternate chain with the same keys, anyone would be able to see that they created these two conflicting chains, what's called equivocation, and that person would be able to take essentially the two conflicting messages and submit it back to the Ethereum protocol and get that person slashed. So in order to do a short range attack on Ethereum, you would basically lose all of your money that you're performing the attack with, which in the case of Ethereum is, in the tens of billions. I don't know the exact, I think it's right now 70 billion, I want to say, something like that. So, 2/3 of that, call it, somewhere in the 40-50 billion range. So that keeps Ethereum secure in the environment that Ethereum was created to operate in, which is nodes stay in sync, they know who has the recent stake, and if somebody performs one of these short-range reorgs, somebody submits proof of that misbehavior to the protocol and gets all of their collateral slashed. But in the case of two things that are relevant to us, which is long-range Ethereum chain proofs, and also in the context of zero knowledge. So today, somebody who controls 51% of Ethereum's consensus power could do essentially create a 51% attack where they don't broadcast their chain that they created globally and try to confuse the actual full Ethereum nodes that are running on the peer-to-peer network, but they could construct a ZK proof of their private chain that they created, and they could trick another protocol into thinking that there is an alternate canonical Ethereum chain, and they wouldn't get slashed because it is zero knowledge. It doesn't reveal anything about that underlying chain other than there is some Ethereum chain that was finalized with 2/3 of the Ethereum consensus power, but unlike broadcasting those blocks to the peer-to-peer network where people could detect it and report that misbehavior, with the ZK proof, nobody could detect it, and you could confuse a protocol that's just using that zero knowledge proof to understand what the state of Ethereum is. And so a practical example of that would be if you were to build an Ethereum to Solana bridging system using zero knowledge proofs. That remote system on Solana is going to be a smart contract that validates a zero knowledge proof of Ethereum state. And so if you controlled 2/3 of the active Ethereum staking power, again, you could create that fake chain, you could keep it private, you could construct a zero knowledge proof of it, and the contract on Solana wouldn't be able to tell the difference between your ZK proof of your chain versus the actual ZK proof of the canonical public chain, because to it, both would look like they're equally valid from a consensus perspective. But also, you were able to confuse that system and not get punished for it because, again, your ZK proof doesn't actually reveal enough information about the fake forked chain that you created for somebody to construct that fraud proof. Basically, it's not a fraud proof, but that the proof of equivocation and return it to the Ethereum protocol. And so, to summarize, we have two dimensions here. We have ZK proofs don't inherit the same slashability / economic security guarantees that standard Ethereum proof of stake has, and that applies to anything using ZK proofs of Ethereum. And the second part is specifically for HBit VM or BitVM style constructions that are using Ethereum in this way where we do need to decide on a canonical Ethereum state as well. They have to live offline for a long time. And so basically when you create a Bitcoin script, going back to our Solana example, that ZK verifier could update every hour. So every hour somebody sends a new ZK proof of Ethereum state, it updates to the new canonical state, and everything's going good. But with HBit VM or other BitVM 2 style constructions, you're pre-configuring the knowledge of Bitcoin and Ethereum in this case, and Hemi in this case, state at the time that the vault's constructed, and that vault may live for 2 years before somebody withdraws from it. And so you can't update the knowledge of current Ethereum state in that BitVM vault because that would require changing the Bitcoin script itself. And to do that, you'd basically be destroying the vault and creating a new one. You would have to do all new transactions. And so realistically, you can't update knowledge of Ethereum in the BitVM vault. Basically, when you construct the HBitVM vault, you get to configure the current state, and then whatever you ZK verify in 2 years or whatever has to work based off of that really old state. And so that introduces another problem where we're not just talking about somebody getting 2/3 of the Ethereum consensus power that's active today, but potentially somebody getting 51% or 66%. It depends. You can parameterize the protocol differently, but a majority or supermajority of the Ethereum consensus power at any point in the chain's history. And so when you look at Ethereum, you can have a bunch of people who they're actively staking now, but then they withdraw their stake, they keep their private keys, and then in 2 years, after they've completely unstaked, they're able to make a alternate chain of Ethereum starting from 2 years ago with those keys that appears, equally valid from a ZK verification of consensus stake perspective. And so you have these really old keys that can be used to create this really old chain. And we have ZK working against us because a ZK proof doesn't have enough information to slash people anyway. But now, even if it did, these people aren't slashable because they've already withdrawn from the protocol and they're using really old keys to attack the system. And so the way we solve that is by we solve Bitcoin can't see itself using Ethereum to create this censorship-resistant layer of collaboratively, permissionlessly establishing the canonical state of Bitcoin. Now we need to reflect that back to Bitcoin, and for that, we need to make sure nobody can do that nothing at stake attack against Ethereum, especially in a zero-knowledge context. So in the white paper, we coined a term ZK nothing at stake, which basically just refers to nothing at stake style attacks, but in the context of ZK, which means that even with recent keys, they're not slashable, and so you lose a lot of the economic security guarantees of Ethereum. And the way we solve that is with the addition to proof of proof. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, to publish additional data about Ethereum, basically enough data about Ethereum so that if there was a conflicting Ethereum chain created, somebody would be able to punish the person who created that forking chain, because they would have to reveal enough information on Bitcoin for them to be slashable. And so with all of those pieces of the system working together, you have Bitcoin, you have Ethereum establishing the canonical state of Bitcoin, and then you have these proofs of Ethereum state to Bitcoin within a certain time frame that make sure that somebody who does a nothing at stake attack, in this case it's no longer nothing at stake because now they're slashable, but if somebody tried to do an attack on Ethereum either using really old keys or using really recent keys, they'd reveal enough information on Bitcoin for them to be slashed. And so now we've recreated the same economic security guarantees that normally keep Ethereum secure, but we can now rely on those in a zero knowledge context. And the way we do it for really old keys is we have certain rules about the timeliness of publications of Ethereum state to Bitcoin, in such a way that if somebody had keys that were 2 years old and they tried to create a attacking chain, they could not create a legitimate attacking chain unless they either were able to 51% attack Bitcoin to retroactively insert those proofs of their forged Ethereum state into an alternate, equally valid looking Bitcoin chain, or they would have to have, from the starting point of 2 years ago, started publishing that data in preparation for this attack, which at that point 2 years ago would have gotten them slashed for publishing that conflicting data to Bitcoin. And so we use Bitcoin as this objective, basically clock that we can publish data to, and that lets us ensure that nobody can create an alternate Ethereum chain unless they expose themselves to slashability, unless they're able to also 51% attack Bitcoin. And so when you combine those two things together, you know, Ethereum establishing secure state of Bitcoin, and Bitcoin keeping Ethereum proof of stake in check and providing the same economic security guarantees for even a long range, 2, 3, 4 years long Ethereum fork in a zero knowledge context, you're able to still inherit all the same economic security properties that Ethereum proof of stake itself has. So that's the HBIT VM proof system. That's the in a vacuum technology you can use and then build a bunch of other stuff on. And so now with that, we don't need the superblock light client emulation system from BitVM2. So we can gets rid of both the vulnerability that it introduces, that minor ransom attack issue, but it also simplifies the actual graph of transactions on Bitcoin itself. And so you go from, I believe it's 11 transactions per operator down to 6. And so now instead of having superblock light client emulation, establishing a canonical superblock and then that being used for the ZK proof to validate against as part of its statement, now the only thing that you have to agree on Bitcoin is the current timestamp. And so if you didn't enforce things around the timestamp, you still have issues where somebody could create, you know, a really old fork of both Ethereum and Bitcoin, but they only do that fork for, you know, a day, and so they need a lot less Bitcoin mining power to do that. And then they could still confuse the system with a seemingly valid ZK proof that's actually not. So all we need to do is have Bitcoin enforce a timestamp, which luckily we can do with relative time locks. So you can basically do it where the person who's submitting the ZK proof also commits with that Lamport signature, that one-time signature, to a timestamp, and that timestamp is the only argument to the only statement rather to that ZK proof. And so the ZK proof basically says there is a valid Bitcoin and Ethereum chain, and they look like this, and we see a valid liquidity fronting transaction on that Bitcoin chain using Hemi as a lens to look inside of Bitcoin and see that information about Bitcoin that we care about. And all of that's valid as long as my assumption that the chain I'm looking at is recent. As long as that's the case, then the zero knowledge proof is a self-contained proof that everything happened in the protocol the way it's supposed to. The operator did the right thing, fronted liquidity, and they should be allowed to withdraw the funds. And so with the HBIT VM tunnel, basically we use the HBIT VM proof system to generate that ZK proof, and then we just feed in the current timestamp on Bitcoin into that ZK proof. And we enforce that basically by adding a additional disprove transaction that burns a connector output, basically removes the operator from the protocol from misbehaving if they commit to a timestamp that's too far in the past. And we can do that, like I said, with relative time locks, which is basically just a way to say this transaction can be executed, X number of seconds or X number of Bitcoin blocks after its previous transaction. And so you have the operator who commits to a ZK proof in one Bitcoin transaction called the assert transaction. And then there's a connector output that is used both for the operator to withdraw the funds at the very end of the protocol, or for somebody to challenge their ZK proof, that optimistic execution of the ZK proof. Or this third path is that they can spend that connector output, even if the ZK proof itself is valid, if more time has elapsed from the committed to timestamp than the challenge period and additional liveness parameter delay in the Bitcoin transaction graph. So basically, we use relative time locks to enforce the operator to commit to a recent timestamp, and that is the only thing. That's the only external context needed for the ZK proof to prove that everything else in the protocol happened the way it should. So that's HBit VM and the HBit VM tunnel system. As far as why we're doing it, obviously there's the piece of solving the superblock-like client emulation problem. So solving that security vulnerability without introducing some other system that reduces the overall trust of the system. And so we're preserving the one event trust, which basically comes down to that covenant emulator. So as long as one in this giant group of participants behaves legitimately or honestly, or at least doesn't collude with the other participants, the system remains completely secure. As long as that is the case, and also that somebody, which can be completely permissionless, anyone in the world can do this, but somebody is basically paying attention and seeing if the operator tries to do something malicious and sends a transaction on Bitcoin to basically stop them from doing it. So we've preserved the original trust model of BitVM2, but we've solved the superblock-like client emulation problem that the solutions to that generally introduce additional layers of complexity and centralization, now another group to commit to recent Bitcoin blocks or things like that. And we've also simplified the transaction graph. So because we don't need to do the whole superblock-like client emulation thing, we can take that part of the protocol out. And with it comes all of the time that it takes to perform that protocol, which there's no agreed upon time, but generally in the order of 1 to 2 weeks. So we've reduced something that would normally take 17 days down to 2 to 3 days, depending on how you parameterize the protocol and how long you give people to challenge an invalid ZK proof. And we've also made it more capital efficient because the transaction sizes, there's not as many transactions going on, which is minor but contributes. But also we can move the incentives onto Hemi, because Hemi with HVM can observe Bitcoin. And instead of needing to bake all of the incentives and all of the potential need to pay Bitcoin fees into the original BitVM2 style transaction graph, now with a combination of HVM's Bitcoin awareness and also introducing a Bitcoin MEV marketplace where you can pay miners dynamically for Bitcoin transaction inclusion, you're able to dramatically reduce the amount of collateral that operators need to put into the system for each BitVM vault. And you're also able to use veHEMI as a restaking system. So you can, instead of having an operator need to put up, $10,000 to participate in each HBitVM vault, you can instead have them put up some larger amount, but then participate in many more vaults. So instead of putting up $10,000 per vault, maybe they put up $50,000, but they can participate in 30 different vaults. And then you can use their collateral as means, if necessary, to pay for the transaction fees for malicious transactions, the disproved transactions that keep the operator honest in the event that the operator misbehaves. We can use HVM to monitor the entire system and proactively detect when an operator is attempting to misbehave in the protocol, and provide dynamic bounties to participants who participate as a challenger. And it also solves one of the incentive alignment issues with the BitVM2 construction, which is the original BitVM construction needed a challenge and a disproved transaction. And the challenge transaction needed to be crowdfunded with a certain amount of Bitcoin. And the person who crowdfunded the disproved transaction wouldn't normally necessarily be the one who gets the bounty from doing the successful challenge, because they're totally different participants in the system potentially. And so with this system, now that we have this external way to monitor Bitcoin with HVM, what we can do is we can move the incentives onto the Hemi layer, and basically the HBitVM Bitcoin tunnel protocol can reward the person who does the disprove and reward the person who does the challenge transaction separately. And so basically solves that incentive alignment issue with getting people to crowdfund that initial challenge transaction to keep operators honest. So that's the nuts and bolts of it. To summarize, basically, it's essentially a ZK bridge to Bitcoin. We've solved the superblock-like client emulation problem with BitVM2 in a way that doesn't compromise the original permissionless or quasi-permissionless model that BitVM2 set out to create. We've retained the one-of-n trust model, and we've also moved the incentives off-chain to make it a lot more efficient to use and also be able to survive even in extremely high Bitcoin fee markets. So that's that was quite long, but we can dive more into the details on Friday, but I think that's probably as deep as we want to go today.
I just want to point out that the original question was, explain this like I'm a 5-year-old.
We have some smart 5-year-olds, okay?
Apparently, our 5-year-olds all have part in the Mensa Society. Holy shit. Well, that was an incredible deep dive. I think all the 5-year-olds left to go watch K-pop Demon Hunter. Next time we're going to phrase it as, please explain it like the child is still in utero or potentially 2 years old at the maximum. We are over and out of time, ladies, gentlemen, amigos, and amigas. But a couple quick updates before we go. I don't know when, but there will be a meme contest of Max explaining insert Hemi tech here to a 5-year-old, and yeah, there'll be a based roll attached to that, and it'll probably turn into a shirt. This is gonna happen sooner than later.
We got to get
but
JCV to do some of these explanations. He can distill stuff down.
we are JCV. You have a lot of work to do on the Teach Rick Crypto show, because if that was to a 5-year-old, then consider me not even at conception yet.
Yeah, I need to start getting my my various pop culture pictures already, because it's going to take a lot of them for this.
Buddy, you're gonna have to dive through the vaults for this one. Holy shit!
No pun intended.
Yeah, no pun intended whatsoever. Couple things to bring up. Joshua did have to drop for a meeting, unfortunately, but we will be introducing a beta testing program that hopefully is going to start today. I'd say tomorrow at the latest. It's completely opt-in, has a low bar of criteria, but you'll be able to basically beta test Hemi Tech before it's readily available. You'll have your own channel. It'll come with a role. You'll be able to report bugs and cool features and just general input directly to the Hemi team. Also share info amongst the the other beta testers and the moderation team. So we're really excited about that. Anything you guys want to add to that?
No, yeah, stay tuned for the beta program. We're going to be rolling that out soon. The first thing that'll be available for testing is the Hemi BTC staking vault. And so you can play around with that. It is still in beta, so there's going to be warnings on the UI that you are using mainnet funds. There could be a bug. Obviously, we're doing our best to test everything that touches mainnet funds prior to putting it in beta, but it is still beta, so there's always a risk. But yeah, looking forward to getting the beta program out there. And yeah, the first thing will be Hemi BTC staking, and then we'll be rolling out testing of some other things, probably starting sometime in January.
So really exciting things are happening. In addition, I just want to bring it up now so everyone can start telling their friends and really rally the community. Next Tuesday, it will be the final Midweek with Max of 2025. We're going to be taking off the 30th just to give some folks some breathing room and more time around the holidays, specifically the team, but also the community as a whole. But next week is a very special episode. There will be additional Hemi team members. We're going to have a looser format. We're not really going to dive into a lot of tech questions, but we will have plenty of holiday-themed questions, and you are welcome to submit some. Yes, Alex, It will also be your last opportunity in 2025 to claim the Rap God role. As Jeff said during a meeting yesterday, so the format is going to kind of be like Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Yup. Yup, it is. So I hope to see all of you and a lot more folks there at the Midweek with Max Holiday Fiesta next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. In the meantime, the holidays are coming up, and don't forget the Hemi Community Collection, available now, with such cool shirts as Something with a Koala, Midweek with Max hoodies, and Rip the Faucet, created by Hemi creator Gladdy. So check out the collection because nothing says the holidays like Hemi. That's a terrible slogan. This is why we have a marketing team. Anyway, uh the 5-year-old has left the room and is watching K-pop Demon Hunter. JCV has a lot of pop culture references to get, and we all need to be heading off now. So let me turn this over to Max and JCV for some outros, and we will all see you. I still can't talk. We will see you all next Tuesday, is what I meant to say.
All right, awesome. I do see a few more questions. I know we're over time, so I'll just bang through these super quick. So when will details of token economics be updated, such as to include the monthly unlocking portion? Not sure what you mean by monthly unlocking portion, if you're talking about the like veHEMI rewards, or if you're referring to the unlock schedule for all the different buckets of tokens. I don't think we have any additional updates to the current economic model that's published going out. We may have some things that dive into a bit more detail, but basically what's out there already is still correct as far as like, team investor, those sorts of unlock piles in the emission schedule. If you're talking about veHEMI, we will be formalizing more of the economic model, probably coming sometime in January. So starting to work towards the next phases of that. So I don't have an exact date there, but look for some of that probably in January, maybe getting implemented in February. Second question, if I have one veHEMI, how are rewards calculated? Does it depend on the time the veHEMI has been locked or on the remaining lock time? So basically the veHEMI rewards are calculated over time. And so you can think of it as basically a daily snapshot. And so if the reward period is, January 1st to January 31st, if you had veHEMI staked from the 15th to the 31st, then you'd be part of the reward pile of half of that month's allocation. And then you would receive for each of those days the relative portion of the reward pool for that day based on your veHEMI stake weight versus the total veHEMI stake weight. So for example, if you had a veHEMI position with 100 tokens in it and you started it today and you did it for 4 weeks, then at the 2-week mark, you would have half the stake weight you did initially because you're halfway through your unlock period. And then at the very last day when it unlocks, you'd have 0. So you can think of a line going from 100% linearly down to 0%. And then each of the days or the rewards that are distributed, the quote unquote snapshot, it's not actually technically a snapshot, but the math is the same. For each of the days of that reward period, you would receive a proportional amount of that day's rewards based on your weight on that day versus the total pool. So if you had 100 tokens for 4 weeks and the only other person in the system had 50 tokens for 2 weeks, then initially you would have basically, you can think of it as 100 times 4. It works the other way around, but basically you would have 100 points versus their 50, but on half the unlock time. So really it's effectively 25. So at the beginning, you'd be getting 80% of the rewards. And then by week 1, they would have decayed faster than you because they're on a shorter lockup. So you'd still have 75% of your initial weight, but they'd only have 50% of their initial weight, which would be like 12.5. So you'd have more than 80%. And then eventually when they're out of the system, you'd be the only person left. And so you'd be getting 100% of it until your position expires. So basically it's the duration of it's the current weight remaining in your veHEMI position, where the maximum weight is if you have a position with 4 years remaining. And it's done daily for a reward period based on your weight relative to everyone else's weight in the system. And the last question, is there a snapshot before each veHEMI reward distribution? Not currently. That could change in the future if we change the mechanics. But it's like I described, where there's no snapshot taken of current state. There's no way to game the system by, you know, getting in right before a snapshot's taken or something like that. It's this daily rolling average of your total stake weight versus the entire stake weight of everybody in the veHEMI system. And I think with that, that's all we have for questions. We've also lost JCV. I think he had actual work to go do. But yeah, appreciate everyone coming out. Excuse me. We will announce when we actually get that HBitVM deep dive engineering AMA scheduled. So hopefully, even though it wasn't a ELI 5 exactly, hopefully for some people that was a helpful kind of overview of what we're working on, and maybe helps to digest the white paper in the next few days. And as soon as we get that breakout engineering AMA scheduled, we will announce that. But tentatively, Friday at the same time as Midweek with Max, that's 11 a.m. Eastern. And yeah, with that, we will close it out. We will, like Rick said, be doing the special holiday edition next week. But I'll take the chance now to wish everyone a very happy holiday, whatever you do celebrate, rather.
Neither one of us can talk today, unless you're talking about the HBitVM. Otherwise,
HBitVM, fine. Telling people happy holidays, that's hard, apparently.
Right, that's out the window.
But happy holidays to everybody. We will see anyone who's able to make it to the holiday edition next week. We'll see you there. And yeah, with that, we will close it out and see everyone next week.
All right. Take care, amigos. Thank you all so much. And for the record, Max, that was an incredible explanation. It was super helpful to many people, just not 5-year-olds. We really got to work on that, buddy.
We will. I will think of some analogies. We'll get better at this.
We're going to need some pictures and some analogies and potentially a coloring book.
Oh, that'd be hilarious. The HBitVM coloring. There's actually a lot of things about the protocol that you could visualize, like visually, and the colors actually mean stuff for the protocol. So that would actually be a hilarious merch item. Would be an HBitVM coloring book.
Oh my God! Someone please make an HBitVM coloring book. That would be the greatest thing ever. All right. Well, yeah. Beta testing program coming very soon. Join us for the holiday party next week. There's going to be tons of giveaways and other cool stuff. Hell, we're going to be giving away some hair tokens, some merch, even some rolls. So you don't want to miss this one. And yeah, with that, we will see you all very soon. Hope to see you all at the breakout AMA once we announce it. And in the meantime, read that white paper and Jesus, keep memeing Max, because these explain like I'm 5 memes are just incredible. So with
They
that,
are hilarious.
they're so good. All right, take care all. See you soon. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks everyone.